Hello and welcome to This Week in Cleantech, the weekly podcast that reviews and shares the biggest and most interesting cleantech news stories of the week. I'm your host, David Hunt, and each week I'll be joined by a guest from the sector to offer their insight and experience. This week I'm joined by eMobility legend Roger Atkins. Knowing Roger for some time, his outlook is one of hope that the convergence of technologies, collaboration between people, and a true circular approach to economics are arriving just in the nick of time. Whilst his electric vehicle narrative has brought him to this point, from here he is now increasingly focused on a more holistic approach, summed up best as ACEs, autonomous, connected, shared, electric. And that's likely to be threaded through his conversation with me here today. But let's dive straight in, Roger, with the first story that's caught our eye. I think the market capitalization of Tesla, 60 billion, and greater than that of GM and Ford and BMW now, actually, and on the up, whereas some of those other big auto OEMs market cap is going down. What are your thoughts around that as a situation?
Well, hi, Dave. By the way, don't call me legend. It makes me feel like I don't know. I should have a few albums out. Or on a tour or something, you know. But as to market capitalization, look, it's a crazy world. It does remind me of nearly 20 years ago now, when the dot-com bubble came along. And as we all know, it burst. There was market capitalization of companies at that time that were crazy. You know, the multiples, typical multiples of times, 4 times, 6 times, 8 times 12, reasonable things. You know, when you look at, I think it's called P, profit to costs or something, there's a ratio. Anyway, it was getting wildly out of kilter back then, and the bubble burst and a lot of companies disappeared. However, some companies with what seemingly were crazy valuations managed to keep going, sustained. Little companies that people had written off as crazy, startups with this stupid profits to earning ratio and all the other things that were just mind-blowingly weird. One of those companies, of course, was Amazon. Amazon's done quite well over this past couple of decades. I say that obviously with all the irony, Dave, because it's done spectacularly well. So I suppose what I'm saying is it has happened before. It doesn't mean it will happen again. But equally, applying sensible economic ratios to things and discounting them because they're wildly out of kilter is possibly a dangerous thing to do. Your over-reliance on this has happened in the past, so it'll happen in the future is possibly a dangerous thing.
Sure. I must confess, as much as I'm a fan of Tesla and what they've done for the clean tech sector, I'm not a fanboy of Elon as much as I respect him. And for quite some time, until even quite recently, I would say I bet 50-50 on Tesla making it through. But they do seem to have solved a lot of the production issues. They do seem to be, from some of the figures I've seen, building cars profitably and in fact, twice as profitably as BMW. I just wonder if they have turned the corner, or I should say, or whether it's another forced dawn. But clearly, the major European OEMs are struggling.
Well, yeah, let's look at what Tesla seemed to do. I don't work there, neither do you. We're reliant on what we hear from people, on the grapevine or wherever else. It strikes me, though, that there are 2 or 3 really important things that are different about Tesla than maybe the traditional companies. Number one, I think everybody at Tesla works harder than anyone else in some of these traditional companies. Because they kind of have to. Why do they have to? I think because they're always in fear of survival. That's a great motivator in many ways. Possibly not great for your health, but I think that's part of the dynamic. I think they're driven by a guy who is really like Marmite. You either really hugely admire and, well, some people seem to love Elon Musk, or you just think he's a crazy, micromanaged sort of zealot of some description that really, has got no place in business doing some of the things that he does. But look at how many really smart people work for him. How many people are drawn to go and work at that business. So as a leader, he clearly has a huge skill set in terms of getting things done. giving people that vision, that mission, and that purpose, and brings them along with him. How many other leaders of a car company could at the same time be running a rocket, company? I mean, it's just you can't make this stuff up. I'm sure the personal toll on him is pretty immense, but he seems to be able to, cope with it to some degree. But I think for investors, for a lot of people, when they see that vision, that mission, when they see that support that he gets from his employees, when they see how hard everybody works, if you compare and contrast that with most of the car companies whose leaders tend to keep their heads down, but when they speak, they're not particularly inspiring. The commercial structures of a lot of those companies are very, they're very bureaucratic. They're very traditional. They're very, they're well organized for sure, but they're not particularly dynamic. The only other company that I think of in a similar fashion to Tesla is Rimac. Run by a guy who's got all that energy, all that passion, works really, really hard. All the people in the company have to work hard. It's 400 or 500 people now at Rimac.
Wow. Okay.
And if you look at what they've achieved in their relatively short time, they're not even 10 years old, not dissimilar to Tesla in many ways. It's a kind of European version. It's a very different company, but some of the same principles apply. And if you look at what Rimac have done and now been invested in by Porsche, for example, you can see where some of these companies now, traditional companies, I think they're surprised. Yeah, maybe are they scared? Perhaps they are. Of just how well, the good technology is that they're developing, how far in advance they're getting with their battery proposition. That goes for definitely Tesla and for Rimac. And who knows? I mean, Dave, I don't think it would be a crazy call to suggest that Mercedes or Daimler, maybe especially under a new leader, under Ola Källenius, might at some point this year look to reinstate that joint venture that they had with Tesla. Why not? I think there'd be a lot of merit for both parties in doing that myself, but, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, there was talk of heads or senior executive level changes at Volkswagen and other places to perhaps better engage. I think I also saw this week, which I guess is another interesting factor, and certainly looking at the economics of which is the costs or the phenomenal amount of money that the traditional OEMs spend on advertising and marketing versus a Tesla zero cost. Marketing, a few tweets from Elon and lots of discussions like this, and everybody's talking Tesla, just how much of an advantage that continues to be, and whether they can maintain that as they perhaps become a bit more mainstream. But you've been in the auto sector a long time. The costs that these guys are throwing at traditional OEMs at advertising is phenomenal, and I just wonder whether that's something again that Tesla have, and perhaps Rimac, if you mentioned, I've never seen an advert, but I know of them because of conversations I've had, not just yourself, but with others. Again, the automotive OEMs, how do you see them being able to perhaps move into this more engaged digital and electric world from a branding point of view?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think there's two ways of looking at it. If we carry on the way that we have, where people are attracted by brand, they want to be associated with a brand for a number of reasons. It's not an exhaustive list as such, but typically it's because the brand offers some form of trust, some sort of almost expected experience, quality of product, quality of service, whatever. Brand has to mean something. It's not just image, but equally image is important. I think the car industry, particularly the prestige car industry, has been massively reliant on keeping that brand image there, so that people don't defect to similar quality vehicles, or some might argue the same quality vehicles, that are substantially cheaper but just don't have that brand kudos. Particularly I'm obviously thinking, I guess, to some extent of the places that I've been. I mean, I've been at Audi, not been at BMW, know a little bit about Mercedes, but, take those three in particular. I'll tell you a quick story, actually, Dave. This goes back a scaringly long time. Oh, my God, this is like This is probably like almost a quarter of a century. I know. It makes me feel old thinking about it. I happen to have, with a small group of people, an audience with Ferdinand Piëch. Back at the time when, for a decade, I worked at the Volkswagen Group, and a lot of that was at Audi. It was just at the time that they rebranded and revitalized the Audi proposition and went from, do you remember, it used to be Audi 80, Audi 90. Yeah, and they shifted into the platform strategy, and they shifted into the new nomenclature, which began with A4, and then was, of course, A6, A8, everything that we know since that time. Anyway, we have an audience with Dr. Piëch. I was told by my boss at the time, Roger, don't ask any questions, just sit and listen. This is a master. Listen and learn. Well, I've never been able to do as I'm told, really. It's got me to a lot of trouble, Dave, along the way. Anyway, I asked Dr. Piëch how we could possibly justify a $4,000 difference between a Volkswagen Passat and an Audi A4, when essentially it was the same vehicle, built on the same platform, with many of the same components, etc. A different badge and some different stuff. Nothing wrong with the Volkswagen Passat. Very, very nice and accomplished car, as was the A4. Well, you could have heard a pin drop in the room when I asked the question. He gave an extremely interesting answer in terms of, the platform strategy and what he was doing. And he asked me what I did, and I thought, I'm going to get fired now. But I said, well, I'm in sales and marketing. And he said, well, your job in sales and marketing is to create the brand differential, is to create the Audi experience, is to create that sense of the people that choose to spend $4,000 more on an A4, that they've got $4,000 worth of value in some fashion. Yeah. The quality of the dealership, the quality of the people, the things that are different. Some of it has to be tangible. Again, it can't just be image. But, there's a case in point. A lot of people over the years, I suppose, came to that conclusion. I'd rather have a Passat and save the money, But some people just love the kudos of Audi as a prestige brand. But I think going forward, Dave, here's where it's going to get really weird and possibly scarily challenging for these big brands, especially prestige, is if getting around isn't about what you own that defines you, it's just simply a commodity, then what's the purpose of brand? If then there's little or no purpose of brand, but let's say there's some, but little, these vast sums of money they spend on brand equity, whether it's in all forms of marketing, whether it's in PR, whether it's in promotion, sports, all the things that tally up to billions of dollars, billions of pounds, billions of euros spent. If they don't need to do that anymore, they can use that money either on the bottom line, or they can put it into the product or the service, or they can not spend it at all in the first place. So it could completely change the dynamics, the financial structure of how some of these companies work.
Yeah, I think I think increasingly you certainly hear stories of service from Tesla, and I think all of us who've ever owned or driven, whether it be a Jag, BM, or an Audi or a Mercedes, of issues with service. And I don't just literally mean the V service, but I mean from dealership service and from issues with the cars and all. Yet you hear myriad stories of, not least of which because it's over, firmware and online more often than not, but where Tesla have really stolen a march on being so intuitive and so engaged with their customer, because they know each customer and their customer profile because of the way that Tesla interacts, and yet with in the short term at least, the big brands know of a personal type, but don't know each individual customer. So I think you're right. There's a big difference, or there's a big issue around the fact that they need to continue to spend money in order to maintain that brand dynamic. I just wonder, you and I obviously talk about sort of the move towards mobility as a service, and I think you were hinting at that now there in terms of where having a BM or a Merc or an Audi on your drive is not the status symbol that it was or is presently. And how do these big auto OEMs engage where they've got to change their message as well as their ability to remain profitable?
Well, here's the thing, Dave. This is one of my parts of my narrative, really. in all of what we're talking about, we're not talking about a clean switch, a clean, click over, a binary change, whatever you want to call it. The market is very different in China to the market in the US. The market is very different in India to Europe. For example, there is a totally corroborated statistic that tells you 22 people out of 1,000 in India own a vehicle, as opposed to 840, I think it is, in America. And I think in China, the number's about 140. Now, behind that metric lies a huge amount of stuff, the history of that country, the social structure, the political scene, economics, lots and lots of things. And that's all a reflection of the past and where we are today. But it's about how different things are going to be in the future that's really exercising minds, because, take India or China, neither of those countries have got room for massive growth in volume. Whereas in reality, we make around, the industry makes around 100 million vehicles a year. There's roughly 1.123 whatever billion vehicles on the planet. So kind of every 10, 11, 12 years, there's a sort of cycling, if you like, of the thing as it goes along. The sense of a lot of OEMs is that we will, because of improved efficiencies and lots of things, more people with money in China and India in particular, we will see 100 million become 110 million, 120 million, 130 million, where those low motorization per thousand of population figures, particularly in India and in China, because they're the most populous countries in the world, they feel that there's volume to be had. There's going to be a growing market. My sense is, and of course, I'm not the only one, is that actually it's going to go the other way. It's going to be fewer vehicles used more often. And why is that? Well, because there's a fundamental shift using technology, whether it's artificial intelligence or the Internet of Connected Things or whatever it is, to maximize efficiency and maximize utilization. That doesn't mean owning something and parking it on your bloody drive. Because that kind of, especially younger people, who I think, Dave, for 2 or 3 reasons, are choosing not to own or aspire to own vehicles. And number one is they can't afford to. It's not even that, there's some kind of societal shift that they've all kind of taken it upon themselves as a group of, as a generation to not want a car. They simply can't afford it. They've either got, huge debts from university or some form of education, or the cost of living, particularly housing, is so great all over the world that the luxury of owning a car as well, even if you're buying it on finance or paying for it on finance, just seems stupid. And they can't afford it. So I really think that the enabling technologies, that some of which I briefly outlined, are arriving at an interesting time and giving an opportunity for change that we haven't had before. So that's kind of where I feel it's kind of shifted along to.
Sure. I think you and I both, talk about mobility as a service or transport as a service, as they refer to it in the US. And I think we'll return to that in a second. I'm just conscious, not wanting to spend all of our time talking about German auto OEMs. But before we, or maybe just a quick comment on the increasing number of German cities, or cities globally, but German cities in particular, that are banning diesels, Cologne and Bonn, the most recent, through the law courts. That sort of dichotomy of the German auto OEM business is worth like 272 billion. It's one of the biggest wealth creators and employers in Germany. And yet at the same time, they're kind of, because of air pollution, cutting themselves or stabbing themselves in the heart to some extent. It's just, again, makes it really between a rock and a hard place to be one of these major auto OEMs, I think. And I don't want to spend too much time on that, but diesel bans and the effect that will have on in the sort of short term on not just the German but auto manufacturers.
I think it's a nightmare, Dave. It's a nightmare for everybody. For the people who end up suffering ill health, that's the number one nightmare. But it is also a nightmare for the industry, because there's no getting away from the fact that the German economy is the auto industry. And the auto industry is the German economy. The problem with where we are right now is that they're not in charge. They're not driving the agenda, and because they're not driving the agenda, they're on the back foot. They're on the back foot commercially. They're on the back foot technically. They're on the back foot in so many ways. And when you try to get, as is sensible to have, a level playing field through organisations like ASEA, which is the Association of the European Manufacturers, that want to, with the EU, discuss and fix and arrange, and I mean fix in the proper fix, by the way. I'm not trying to be funny using that word. A level playing field so people know what to engineer, what to manage, what the proposition is out to the public. That works well up to a point. And like I say, we know some of the wrong uses of the term fix. But when you have cities starting to break ranks from within their own country, let alone the EU as a whole, it makes it almost impossible for OEMs to cope with it, because it also makes it difficult for a driver. If you're on continental Europe and you're driving between Paris and Bonn, or from Bonn to Brussels, or from Brussels to Amsterdam, and you've got different arrangements for your particular car in those cities, especially if it's a diesel, you don't know your ass from your elbow after a while. It gets really, really tricky. So I suppose what I'm really saying is, I think this is going to accelerate. It's accelerating for lots of reasons, mainly because, I think the agenda switched a few years ago, and I think Dieselgate was fundamental in part of that switch from a CO2-focused legislative background and public narrative to a clean air legislative and public background. So the cities seem to be driving the clean air agenda. The national authorities, like ASEA and the European Union, seem to be driving the CO2 agenda. And then there's this clash now, this schism between the two things. So, it's a difficult time, but we do have to be careful what we wish for. On the one hand, I'm a massive advocate for electric buses and taxis and vans, clean the air up as quickly as possible, have a kind of Chinese approach to that to some extent, because they've been doing it better. But what I wouldn't want to see is destabilizing these huge industries that are so important to economies, because if you damage the economy, you damage so many other things. You damage budgets to aid support, to mitigate climate change. You really do, a lot of, there's an unintended consequence to it, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think you and I'm a very staunch advocate for making the transition to, firstly to e-mobility and then into mobility as a service as quickly as is possible. But I should say equally conscious of there's that sort of chaos theory of consequence. And as much as I'm not an advocate of step by step and slowly, but there has to be some balance or some mitigation or some way of helping these companies transition. Same with the utilities in the sort of the renewable energy space, which perhaps we can is a conversation for another day. I think something you touched on there is how cities and mayors particularly are sort of leading the way in many regards in terms of transition because of their responsibilities to health and the public. And as you know, cars is only part of a transportation means. I saw this week that Paris had planned to launch a bike sharing scheme of around 10,000 bikes, I think. So have you any thoughts of sort of the multimodal element of cities and how cities can drive the agenda towards, walking, cycling, electric bikes, taxis, and further into sort of autonomous means of transport and pods? A broad question and not a lot of time to discuss it, but just some thoughts on bike sharing and sort of multimodal transport around cities?
Well, I tell you one thing I'd like to see more of and hear more about, Dave, is ask the public what they want. both ask them, both in terms of what have we got today and how would you like what we've got today to be better, and then perhaps make some suggestions and say, what if we had this, what if we had that, would you like it, would you pay for it, so on and so forth. I do think all of us, certainly myself included, need to be careful that we don't tell people what they want or suggest that we're some kind of voice of the public, where all we've actually done is read some stuff or spoke to a few people and we all work within a certain kind of domain. You're in your space, I'm in mine. I talk to people like Lucas Neckerman and other people we all know, that we don't just convince ourselves of what it should be. I would like the narrative to have a lot more input from the public, because I hope what would be said is, we just need to have something that's value for money, that's reliable, that's safe, that's benign to the environment, and that what that actually comes out to is very much consultative. I don't mean endlessly consulting. I don't mean trying to please everybody everywhere. You don't have to go for it sometimes, in truth. But should we have electric bikes and more shared bikes? Of course we should. Should it be easier to walk safely somewhere? Absolutely. Should we be able to, have first mile, last mile, hooking up and joining things up nicely? Absolutely. There's no doubt those things are just common sense. And we are getting there. Let's not forget that it isn't like a complete mess out there. When you use an app, for example, as I'm sure you do, and I'm sure many people do, City Mapper, and City Mapper helps you plan that multimodal sort of multiple choice journey from A to B. How much does it cost? What's the time it's going to take? Oh, I don't think I'll do that. Or I think I'll try option 2 or whatever. These things are now starting to happen and starting to deliver, and they're getting better. So that's my general thought. But I think we do have to be careful that we don't go around prescribing what the world's to become.
I think that's again, we've heard stories in a number of cities of where certainly dockless cycle schemes have come crashing down for a variety of reasons. Now, some of those around, I guess, social behaviour and the people throwing bikes in canals, but equally, I think there's an element of, as you say, sort of prescribing a solution rather than actually listening to what the solution might be on a city by city basis.
And let's be honest, the weather has something, a part to play in this. I guess if you're in the south of France or you're in Italy, in general, you're more probably inclined to be on a bike or walk around than elsewhere. That being said, our friends in the Nordics and certainly in the Netherlands and in Denmark, etc. I mean, they don't exactly they're not blessed with wonderful weather. You do see a lot more people on bikes there, don't you? So
absolutely. And again, I think I don't know what the numbers are. They're quite staggering in terms of new bicycle sales. I think in the Netherlands and Belgium, generally looking at I think it's 1 in 2, 1 in 3 bikes sold now has some form of electric capability, which is. That in itself is phenomenal. But absolutely, you and I do a lot of traveling. You spend time in Germany or Netherlands or Belgium or France, and people are cycling infinitely more than in the UK. And I'm not sure what the scene is in the US. Clearly, a very different sort of geography and terrain, I guess. But even in cities, I don't see or hear much of cycling as a way of getting about.
Yeah, I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's going to shift, and I think cycling has had a renaissance in this country. Especially the road racing, middle-aged lycra man and woman out and about at the weekend. There's a bit more of that. I look dreadful in lycra, Dave, so there's no way I'm ever going to do that.
It's a vision I'm going to stick with for the next 10 to 15 minutes in my head. Thanks, Roger.
What was that character called? Mr. Blobby. I look like Mr. Blobby on a bike if I've got lycra on. I'm not doing it. If someone takes a picture of me, that's the end of it. So, okay. But it would be good to see more cycling, I think, in terms of commuting. I don't, not just out for the race.
Okay. I want to return back to autonomous in a moment, but again, just a story which is, I guess, relevant both to the energy transition as much as the mobility transition, and that was a report recently by BNEF, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance team, around batteries and predictions for prices, they tend to be in the past, I think, conservative, certainly compared to the likes of Tony Seaver and Rethink and others. But they've recently put out a report with a 52% reduction in battery cost prices. This is lithium batteries by 2030, a 942 gigawatt annual market, amongst other things, and a £1.2 trillion investment required to get there. Batteries, as we say, are instrumental in all forms of electric mobility, but the grid services for energy storage, both behind and above the meter. Phenomenal opportunities that come from that. My other company, Hyperion Executive Search, we do an awful lot of work in energy storage as much as in e-mobility, and I've seen huge changes already in those sectors. Again, not pigeonholing you entirely back to the automotive agenda, but as we know, batteries are a fairly substantial cost of an electric vehicle, be that a boat, bike, plane, or car. How do you see that level of reduction in cost impacting what's possible and what's affordable?
I think it's a big issue, to be honest with you. I think it's almost like something that we all kind of skirt over a little bit, particularly the cobalt element in terms of materials for batteries. And I don't think we can do that. I think we've got to be totally open book in the way in which the discussion is had, and not just sort of push awkward things to one side. Otherwise, we're just hypocrites. Again, going back to where are we with the development of EVs, I kind of have a sense that we will see increasingly rapid adoption of electric buses, taxis, and vans. The good thing there is that that's volume for sure, but it's not mass volume. I think in seeing those things come along, I think I've become one of the most boringly dull, banging on people in the world about two other aspects of infrastructure, which is wireless charging and battery swapping. But both of them, have not really made an appearance in the charging infrastructure thing. Charging infrastructure, that's another issue. We won't get onto that. But to answer your point, I don't think it's all about the battery. So, for example, if over the next few years we see mass adoption of buses, taxis, and vans, a lot of that can be supported and aided by either battery swapping or, better still, in my view, wireless charging. In other words, you're putting the electrons in on the go, both static and on the go, and you're mitigating the need for a big battery. So I think that's a piece in the story yet to emerge. I sense it's going to, and when it does, I think it will come very, very quickly. And also, I don't think we should be wholly reliant on batteries. It's almost like I sometimes feel perhaps I'm inadvertently part of some sort of battery mafia, where so honestly, Dave, you're sometimes at a meeting, and if someone dares mention a fuel cell, it's a bit like everyone would jump on top of them and say, "You're an idiot! Don't you understand how this all works?" But if you look particularly at stationary storage, and you look at specific, very large but nonetheless niche applications, particularly in commercial fleets, where the fuel cell proposition has a lot of merit, we shouldn't be wholly reliable on batteries. And of course, there are lots of other ways in which you can contain, manage, distribute energy that aren't all about batteries. So I think there are plays yet to come in the wonderful way in which people can innovate and change all our future. We don't hear so much, but I think there's a lot coming with nanotechnology. That whole arena of being able to, at the micro level, the nano level, develop capabilities in materials to achieve things that currently just seem impossible. So it isn't all about batteries and chemistry and how much per kilowatt hour. And then of course there's battery management systems, the way in which we actually manage at a cell level within a pack the performance of any given battery. Where we're perhaps not so reliant on lithium ion batteries, wonderful as they've been since the guys at Sony and others here in the UK, of course, discovered, invented, nurtured them, there's always a next chapter in the story.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's important from this podcast point of view, that we are technology agnostic within the clean tech arena. And I think it's a big challenge. I think certainly we've heard from many clients and startups that I speak with looking to get finance, trying to get either projects and or R&D invested in outside of lithium-ion is a real challenge. And yet there are solutions around fuel cells you mentioned. Hydrogen, of course, is a massive implication. We're going back to battery technologies, flow batteries and others really do struggle for capital. That was one thing that did jump out from this BNEF report. Was once again, it was very focused on lithium-ion, lithium-ion, which clearly, as you say, solves an awful lot of problems, but isn't the only show in town, depending on the application and, of course, and depending on innovation, which leads to.
I liked what you just called it then, Dave. Lithium-ion. It's sort of giving it a personality.
He's a good friend of mine.
yeah. I've never bumped into lithium-ion. I know a few other lithiums, but none of them are ions. But yeah. No, listen, I think you're right. We've got to be agnostic. And I do think in the whole way in which, whether you share things on LinkedIn as you do and myself, or, what we do in our work, we should be pragmatic. We should be prepared to listen sometimes to the people that sound a bit crazy, because, sometimes they're not.
I remember in 2007 when I first got involved in Cleantech, I told people that I was going to set up a solar PV installation business, and they looked at me like I had three heads. So that's a matter of 10 years. If they still look at me that way, it's for different reasons these days. But going back to your point, and sort of Elon Musk 5-10 years ago was looked at, and I'm sure as an absolutely crazy kind of guy, and now he has an organisation that's got 60 billion market cap. But before we sort of close out, Roger, I wanted to sort of cover or talk about a couple of areas where you're well versed, and I know that you're quite passionate about, and sort of loosely around the story that came up in terms of Volkswagen Group investing in or joining this consortium called Apollo, which is a self-driving, autonomous driving consortium as part of a Chinese giant called Beidou, who I've not come across before. But can you spend some time in China? You've got a lot of contacts there, and autonomous driving, or certainly the move towards AI applications. Again, huge topics in themselves. But have you any sort of thoughts on certainly the sort of the short to medium term? Will Apollo and their like be able to compete with Waymo and Tesla, who've already got a good steer on, if you pardon the pun, on autonomous driving? And where do you see the Chinese broadly coming into the mobility sector in Europe, having talked about some of the challenges that the European OEMs are facing?
Blimey, Dave, there's about 17 questions in
there. That's for the next 3 hours there.
All right, let me start at the beginning. The story of China's great development, particularly these last 10 years, has come out of lots of companies, but in particular what they call the BAT companies. There are three, BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. Now, these three companies are monolithic companies in China, and better still, in terms of having that scale and scope, they have diversified and invested into many other things. So take Baidu, for example, because they're all very much internet-based. They're all very much inherently about connectivity. They are at the forefront of how China has massively embraced the cell phone, the mobile phone, the smartphone. And what that's enabled are all sorts of things to happen across the country: transactions, commerce, mobility, lots of things that we do use, of course, in the rest of the world, but not to the same degree culturally as they now do in China. Equally, I think that the Chinese government, because it's structured in the way that it is, without getting into that particular topic, are very focused on on coordination, collaboration, and bringing things together, and actually, making it part of a really robust industrial strategy. And they do that, as we all know, every 5 years with a 5-year plan that works, seems to work very, very effectively. I think, well, they're absolutely at the forefront of AI, and therefore they're at the forefront of IoT, and therefore they're at the forefront of connected, autonomous, shared, and electric vehicles. These things are all relatable. So, the Apollo program, I know a bit about it, and I think, the fact they've chosen NASA's American 1960s space program as the name for it, I think says everything. It's about having an ambition with an objective, and you will achieve it. You go back to the famous Rice speech from Kennedy in 1961, I think it was. He basically, declared this extraordinary ambition of America to land a man on the moon, and they did. Okay, they only had about 6 months to spare, but they did it within that decade. And I think the Chinese have a similar ambition to do with connectivity and all that's embraced by, maximizing efficiency and maximizing utilization at scale. So it's about connected, intelligent autonomy. And I don't just mean level 5 autonomous cars driving around.
Sure. No, it's
connected, autonomous, intelligent autonomy. I mean about, just making everything work so much better than it does today, because you can.
It's interesting. I was at the European Utility Week in Vienna last week, and just seeing how IoT, connectivity, smart solutions are dominating the utility world. It's not just about mobility, as you say. It's around how society functions and how energy functions and how we, live and work and breathe. It sort of crosses all of those factors. And again, so I'm just really intrigued to see how the innovation coming out of China, I should say they have some advantages and some disadvantages, but certainly that mission, that sense of mission of this is what we can achieve, this is what we will achieve, and this is how we go about it. Some of this is sort of about visibility. You also know the guys at NEO and Byton and others, and sort of electric cars is one of the obvious ways in which we do see their impact, and obviously BYD in particular with buses. Do you see that on the streets of Europe and the US that there'll be increasing number of Chinese, Southeast Asian vehicles, again to the detriment of European manufacturers, or that they might struggle to keep up?
Yes, the Chinese are coming. I think that's exactly what's happening. Again, try to be agnostic culturally and all the everything else, Dave. To deal with the fundamental challenge of our time, which is climate change, and people will groan when they hear that. Some people will groan when they hear that, but it absolutely is. I think now that the challenge and the task at hand is to accelerate all of the countermeasures, and they're across everything. They're about agriculture, they're about marine, they're about shipping, they're about automotive, they're about all these things. We've got no choice but to use technology to get the job done, to build the countermeasures as quickly as possible. And I think what's different about China is they have much more collaboration going on, driven by the government, demanded by the government, in truth, than we have here. We haven't quite twigged yet, I think, in the Western world, how to manage collaboration with competition. For sure, it happens a lot in the auto industry. You have lots of suppliers, you have lots of joint ventures, you have lots of things. But how well they work, in truth, not really sure. You don't seem to see regular forums where this whole thing is brought together. I've witnessed this a couple of times in China, where essentially it's like everyone who's in the field's brought together. It's like, let's take stock of where we are. And then it's almost literally like saying, right, you work with him, you work with her, she can work with those people over there. All in which you're essentially, wiring together, putting together this amazing collaborative approach, which is what the Apollo program was for America. The greatest, in my opinion, I don't know, okay, I'm 60 years old, so I suppose it's part of my age. But you know, if you want to make America great again, give all the money to NASA and help them collaborate like they have with the space station, with the Russians. Look at what the space station gives us, Dave. The International Space Station, to me, and I think many people, is the exemplar of what humanity now needs to do to tackle climate change. Come together, work collaboratively with, you know, a common mission and an aim and a purpose.
Absolutely.
Keep your cultural differences, keep your national identity, keep all of those things for sure. But we will have none of this if we don't deal with this enormous task at hand. So, sorry. You know?
No, I'm really pleased that you came around to that. I mean, ultimately, that's why you and I do what we do. That's the reason behind this podcast, is we see, you know, technology as a solution to absolutely the world's biggest problems in terms of climate change and air pollution, which is sort of a byproduct of that. And I think we should not be afraid to shout that from the rooftops. And absolutely, we need to collaborate. We need to be technology agnostic, but we do need to accelerate it. Reminded me of another Hyperion client, the supercap company called Skeleton, and one of their missions is just to get shit done. You know, it doesn't really matter how, within reasons of ethic and all, but let's get stuff done. We need to be doing this, and I think accelerating the clean tech revolution is what you and I are both about. That's the reason for this podcast, and I think we're increasingly, hopefully, coming to a time where more and more people see us as not the weirdos on the outside of the extremes, but as the people driving the narrative that needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, Dave, conscious of what momentous moment yesterday was, 100 years since the end of a dreadful war, there were a couple of things that I really felt were quite a big moment. One was seeing the Germans and the British together at the Cenotaph in London laying wreaths. I thought, this is really, a thing to see. This is about people working together more. I know the dreadful counterweight to that is where we are in terms of the European discussion, without getting into that one. But yeah, this is a really pivotal moment in time, and it's important that we say what we say. But then we also do stuff. I think one thing that we mustn't just do, and I think your company does well, is put the right people together in the room. I guess, recruitment, if you don't mind me saying, doesn't necessarily have a great reputation as an industry. But
sure.
if your focus is, well, I know what it is, it's in this sector, is about finding a way to put the best talent together in the right room, so those people can, of course, have a good job and get paid well, but equally, and for a lot of them, more importantly, do good stuff, make a difference, accelerate Absolutely. The stuff that needs to be done. Then, everybody's happy. You can feel good. You've placed people into the right place. Those people feel great about their work. There's one thing I've learned about engineers when I worked at Ricardo was they love solving problems. Some of them are a bit weird, but the common thread through all of them, which I hugely admire, is that they can't stand a problem they can't solve. They have to fix it. So if we put enough of these people together to deal with this epic challenge of climate change, I am cautiously optimistic that, hooking up to artificial intelligence as well, using the best of people and the best of machines is how we, what was your phrase, Dave? Get shit done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's saying increasingly that's the agenda, that we can collaborate, we can bring back the best of technologies. And as you say, from our point of view, it's putting the right people in the right place at the right time to further the agenda. So conscious of a little bit of background noise here, I think thank you for your time today, Roger. I think it's been very engaging. I know you and I could probably talk for another 5 hours and not draw too much breath, but probably best that we conclude things here. So thanks for your time. I hope you at home have enjoyed today's podcast and discussions. Please share your feedback via the LinkedIn group, our Twitter account, which is at Week in Cleantech. Also on our Facebook page, and the This Week in Cleantech website will be live shortly, where you'll be able to download. Again, all reviews via your podcast download site of choice will be appreciated, be that iTunes or Switcher or others. If you'd like to hear more from Roger, and I'd certainly recommend that you do, you can contact him via LinkedIn, where he has over 250,000 followers, and via his Instagram account, which is at Electric Vehicles Outlook. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast this week. Next week, we'll have more voices from the front line. If you've enjoyed it, then please share your feedback with us. And thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Roger.
Cheers, Dave.